Welcome to Unsheltered Conversations, a podcast from HomeAid America, where we explore the human stories, bold solutions, and transformative partnerships shaping the response to housing and homelessness in our communities. I'm your host, Scott Larson. Today's episode marks a milestone of both remembrance and renewal. 2 years ago, the wildfires in Lahaina devastated one of Hawaii's most cherished communities, leaving thousands displaced and homes reduced to ash. Out of that tragedy came a collective resolve to rebuild not just structures, but lives. I'm joined today by three remarkable leaders at the heart of that effort. Kimo Carvalho, Executive Director of HomeAid Hawaii, who has led the charge to create Ka Laʻi Ola, a community of healing and hope for wildfire survivors. Alongside him are Dave Kosko, Senior Principal, and Mark Kiner, Principal at Bassini and Lagoni Architects, whose design vision has brought Ka Laʻi Ola to life, balancing urgency, dignity, and cultural respect. Together, we're going to talk about what it took to create this place of peaceful recovery, the lessons it offers for disaster recovery everywhere, and the hope that still rises in Lahaina. As we begin the conversation, I want our listeners to know a little bit about Kimo, Dave, and Mark as well. So Kimo has been the executive director for HomeAid Hawaii for about 2.5 years. However, his collective life experience, his work in the field of housing and human services, as well as being a paramedic at the time of Hurricane Katrina, has all led him to be the leader that he is today and being able to respond to when the fires hit a little over 2 years ago. HomeAid Hawaii, in and of itself, is one of HomeAid's 19 affiliates around the country, was established about 10 years ago, and was doing great work establishing key communities particularly on the island of Oahu, and working with developing infrastructure and help as HomeAid affiliates do across the country. But little did Kimo know that when he took the job, that 2 months later, that the fires would hit Lahaina and everything would unfold. And I hope that in today's conversation, he can explore a little bit about that. With both Dave and Mark, both of them have held key leadership positions within HomeAid. Dave sits on the board of HomeAid America and has for several years. And the background and support from him personally, as well as with Bassini and Lagoni, goes back over 30 years ago with HomeAid Orange County and the development of Playhouses for Project Playhouse, a key fundraising event for many years. And we've appreciated Dave's leadership and his skills and expertise. And Mark specifically has been involved with the design and the development of key significant groundbreaking projects throughout the Orange County community, starting with a program called Mary's Shelter, which is a program to house young women that are pregnant. That led to his involvement with Emmanuel House, which was at the time the design of a facility for individuals that were either had HIV or living with AIDS. That led to the development in the design of some permanent supportive housing for that population called San Miguel. And most recently, the completion of a project called FX, which is permanent supportive housing for those that have been chronically homeless in the city of Santa Ana. So both Dave and Mark bring key skills and expertise to this community and what we do. When the fires hit in Lahaina a little over 2 years ago, being a resident of Southern California and used to wildfires, I had no idea of the potential devastation that was about to unfold. And we're going to hear today a little bit about how that happened. Something that within 24 hours, nearly 14,000 people were without their home. And many of those individuals might have had other options of where they could live, but to lose your home within 24 hours was extremely devastating. To lose a community that not only Hawaiians love, but around the world love. And the outpouring of support and concern was immediate. And as we looked at it, all the focus of the world was on Lahaina in that first week in August of 2 years ago. So, Dave, you personally were actually on Maui at that time of the fires.
Yes.
And can you take us back to that moment? What you saw, what you felt, you were there with your family. How did that experience shape your commitment to this project?
Sure. Thanks, Scott. And good to see you, Kimo. Um, yeah, I've been going to Maui. I'm a resident of Southern California as well, so it seems to be the destination for us Southern Californians. I've been taking my family there for 21 years plus, and I've got to say, we look at it as one of the most special places on the planet to raise your kids there. It's got a special place in our heart. So we arrived on the island. We go the same time every year. Usually the first week of August. We stay at a resort in Kaanapali. We've got a view from our balcony looking down towards Lahaina and to the north towards Kapalua. And the trip started like any other year. Got there, it was bliss, sunny, beautiful, hot. Uh, but we arrived Saturday. Sunday's typically a get acclimated day and kind of adjust. And then Monday we get up and that starts the real fun. Well, this particular Monday when we woke up, the winds were really strong and the power was out. 5:30 in the morning, we got out of bed and noticed something just seemed odd. And I stepped out on the balcony with a cup of coffee, only to see lawn chairs flying. We'd never seen that before. We'd seen our fair share of wind and hurricane warnings and potential for some unruly conditions, but never anything like this. And the power clicked back on maybe around lunchtime and then quickly went out again. And we just had an odd feeling about it. Well, fast forward, and Tuesday by mid-afternoon, West Maui was really experiencing some hardship. And by dusk, as the sun went down, the fires really started to rage. They started up in the hills, and you could literally see the fire kind of roaring down the hillside. And in the black of night, you saw Lahaina basically ignite. I mean, it was almost spontaneous. They say that these flames were moving at 60 miles per hour, which is a big part of the reason it took so many lives, because nobody had time to react or respond. It was, without a doubt, one of the most traumatic things to witness, to even imagine that we were in basically the middle of it, me worrying about my wife, my daughter. The following day, when we got up, no power, no Wi-Fi, no cell phones, no food. There was no way to cook. Basically, everything had shut down. No restaurants were open. Drove around, and it was truly like Armageddon, war zone. We've heard all these words, and you get to a point where you're wondering, what are we going to do? What are we going to eat? How are we going to survive? And all I kept thinking in the back of my mind was, I'm a visitor here. I'm likely going to get off this island. I couldn't stop thinking about the locals and the devastation that they were going to have to live with for years to come, where I could come back to my shelter, my home, my life in Southern California. So we did finally get off the island. Needless to say, it was Friday morning after 3 days of rations and soup kitchen lines. And I remember sitting at the airport waiting for our flight. And I think that's when I sent an email to both Scott, you and Kimo, about what had happened and the call to action that we as HomeAid really needed to put into place. And literally, I mean, Kimo was on it even before that email. I think you'd already, our wheels were already in motion. So to sit where we sit today and see what's been accomplished, it 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 warms my heart that the commitment, and we're going to talk a lot about the commitment of a lot of people. It's a phenomenal story.
Well, Dave, I'm extremely grateful that you personally were safe in that process in your family. You did not expect to be in soup line kitchen, that type of concept amidst that turmoil. And I'm grateful that your family was safe. And there were, I'm glad you touched base on it, but because there were over 100 individuals, residents of Lahaina, that lost their lives. And we don't want to discount that in this recovery process. And your
Absolutely.
experience, in addition to you, one of our other HomeAid America board members, Bill Balfour, was also there. And I know the two of you have shared that common bond and experience. Kimo, you and I had been talking before the fires about the work that you were beginning to do actually in Lahaina. You've been working on what's called a Ka Laʻi, and maybe you can explain a little bit of that to our listeners. But you were actually preparing to do work in Lahaina when the fires happened. But in those first chaotic days, how did you personally navigate the immense challenges, the uncertainty, the sense of urgency, and the loss? And what helped guide you in mapping out what you were going to do with all the unknowns?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And Dave and Mark, it's good to see you both. Homemade Hawaii was, starting to develop some partnerships with community groups in Lahaina. We were responding to an urgent need for more Kauhali villages to help homeless individuals in West Maui, just develop a few villages so that they can actually start moving into some stable housing. So there's actually a lot of progress being made, and we've been developing, really positive relationships. And it was our first stab at breaking away from an Oahu-centric operation to expanding to our neighbor islands. And I'm a neighbor islander, and I think that it's just, there's a lot of differences, and I think some of the characteristics of what Dave had outlined, it makes Hawaii special. And so to bring, some of that spirit to a area that we all love and care for, it was really humbling to just kind of start developing these relationships. So the August wildfires in 2023, I was very new to the job, but I wasn't new to the experience. And I think to navigate it, it just takes a lot of leadership, reflection on your values, and being very focused on the objectives. In the first days of the wildfires, I think some of the words that Dave used, Armageddon, I think is definitely one sentiment, but it felt like there was trauma in the air. There was sort of this energy and this feeling that it didn't feel right. It didn't set right with anything. It just didn't feel like home anymore, and it felt like community trauma. That was the first time I really kind of felt that in a personal way because it was my home. And so, I think the first weeks of the wildfires, we immediately connected with the state of Hawaii. And at the time, the first days are usually disaster response, and we are not a uh, homeless response provider. So we were in discussions with our governor about focusing on disaster recovery. And our governor, Josh Green, had said, there's going to be American Red Cross, FEMA, all these disaster response providers that are going to help as many people as possible get into congregate shelters, into the hotels in Anapali. We want to make sure they're safe, they're stable. And so at that time, that was the focus. And so he asked myself and at the time our chief housing officer to focus on disaster recovery and to identify land and start thinking about more interim housing programs that we can start focusing on. And so I had my marching orders. And the first few days, in addition to disaster response, we also had modular companies throughout the world calling our Hawaii Emergency Management state agency, trying to sell their products to our state. Everyone's trying to leverage the disaster as an economic opportunity. And so our government was just getting inundated with salespeople. And so HomeAid Hawaii started playing interception. We diverted a lot of those inquiries to our organization, and we started screening all the different modular manufacturing companies that were looking to do business here. Being project managers and developers, we just kind of got back to our practice. And so we created a screening matrix that looked at how to assess, the fairness and the products and the longevity, the warranties, and basically thoroughly vetting products to be a public benefit and an investment for our state government. And so we were focused on screening modular products. We convened a lot of the area landowners and the different developers in Maui. We started assessing lands to the point where we started filtering which lands are most viable based on infrastructure. And then from there, we started looking at how can we utilize those lands based on the population that was in the hotels that we knew needed interim housing. And we started identifying two different subpopulations, for lack of better words. So there was those who were FEMA eligible and those who were FEMA ineligible. So you had homeowners, for example, who maybe they had private insurance, but those insurance policies did not allow them to access FEMA resources, and so they were stuck. And the delta to the rebuild cost compared to what the assistance that they got from their insurance, it's about $500,000 average. And so they just don't have the finances to get back on their feet, get back to their properties. And then you have those who are immigrants, those who are renters, those who were really are working poor across West Maui, and they were stuck. And they also didn't qualify for FEMA assistance for various different reasons: address issues, lack of identifications. And so there's just a whole group of people now identified in the thousands that really did not have the resources to stabilize it. So Governor and I made the decision to for HomeAid to focus completely on FEMA ineligible households who needed interim housing for at least 5 years to support the rebuild of Lahaina.
You touched on a couple of things that I wanted to bring a point back to, because HomeAid is not a disaster response entity like the Red Cross or other groups like just even Team Rubicon and others that showed up there within virtually minutes and days. But you brought up the disaster recovery piece. And I think you've really been able to, although it just took a few minutes to describe what you did in months, that is really an important piece to delineate and to know the role that you played that wasn't what other people were playing, and to know our lane. Were you able to work alongside those other entities? Because I think this maps out potential other options for HomeAid into the future in knowing what our specific role could be. Can you describe that a little bit of your working relationship with those that were doing disaster response versus now what you're doing with disaster recovery?
Traditionally across the country, FEMA takes the lead on disaster recovery housing development. And for those who are not qualified for FEMA, they do not get support. And so what we have seen is generational poverty that actually becomes a pipeline into homelessness just because of this gap group. In terms of our role, there was no one else here in Hawaii qualified and able to respond the way HomeAid did. We did not compete with anyone. We augmented a system that really had a gap. And in addition to that, when I listened to the podcast with Kevin Adler, and I was reflecting on just the changing face of homelessness across the country. In the next decade, we will have more migrants, a lot more socioeconomic instability with migration, and more impacts of natural disasters that actually facilitates that migration. It actually leads to another pipeline of homelessness. And so natural disasters causes homelessness. And I believe that, and you talk to our residents, they feel they're homeless. They've lost their home. They cannot go back home. And for most of our residents at Ka Laʻi Ola, they have been to at least an average of 7 homes before they ended up at Ka Laʻi Ola. That instability causes stress, anxiety, all the social determinants of health that affects an unsheltered person on the streets. It's exactly the same. It might be a different subpopulation, but we need to be more adaptive and responsive to the changing face of homelessness, the way that Kevin Adler and others describe. And I believe that for HomeAid Hawaii, we are fulfilling that role. It might be different across the country, but nevertheless, those are the needs of our people today.
And that's an important piece, because whether or not it's the wildfires that occurred earlier this year in LA, or even the devastating flooding that occurred in the Central Texas area, you're right. People have lost their housing. And if you don't have a place for them to go on the short term, you are going to be bouncing between there's an individual that I know that lost his home. He didn't even lose his home, lost his garage in the Altadena fires, but his home was unoccupiable. He's been in 13 different housing placements since the first of the year. So you're discussing a very important piece that I think is very much in the future of HomeAid in our work. So you came up with the name, and we wanted to put something on it called the Maui Housing Initiative, and it was kind of a focal point for us for raising dollars and bringing attention to the work that you were doing. Walk us through kind of that inception of Ka Laʻi Ola. You looked for land, And I was over there with you when we were looking at a variety of different sites, but then you landed on this one particular site. Talk about how that site came together. And we're going to step into the design of that project, but how did that piece of property come together? And what are the uniquenesses of that piece of property and why that versus some of the others?
Well, the Maui Housing Initiative, we knew that this is going to be a decade or more or a generational problem that we would have to, respond to. And so we needed a brand and a rallying point to really kind of get behind and really commit to Maui as a place that we were going to be committed to. And so the brand really allowed us that ability to raise funds, be responsive and committed to this community long term. I feel that we really made a good impact by branding that so that we were committed. And I think the community felt that, which was a great first start. In terms of the land, we had vetted over 37 different land sites. I personally walked, I feel like near 100 miles of different properties, and I definitely drove the entire island of Maui. I saw places I never saw before. Ultimately, what we heard from the residents is I want to be as close, if not in my home in West Maui. That was critical. By being displaced into another community, it just adds to the trauma, instability. And so we really made a concerted effort to find land in West Maui near their home. And the second thing they were saying is if there's no schools, if there's no groceries, if there's no jobs, then what's the point of housing? And so it really became a campaign around housing and so, we wanted to really kind of think about the integration of a site within the community. Ultimately, we landed on the site that we're at because it is a place of peaceful healing and recovery. Actually, interestingly, the cultural connection to this place, it actually goes back, almost a century, where this actually was a place where Native Hawaiians were actually getting respite. It was a place where there was a lot of water. There was a lot of spiritual connections. And ironically, this story got lost and it got sort of repurposed through the branding and the naming of Ka Laʻi Ola and the site that we're at. So there's quite a lot of spiritual energy that just kind of came together with the design, the development, and ultimately what we're doing for Lahaina. But this site here was what we call ceded lands. So Native Hawaiians once owned it. It was taken away when the U.S. government came in and annexed Hawaii. The federal government had taken it away, gave it back to the state of Hawaii. And so there was just a lot of community turmoil around just that, just that situation alone, Scott. It was a little messy. So for HomeAid to come in, and to say, this is the right site, it wasn't just about a response to the wildfires, but it was also really a response to this community's historic community trauma. And so it took a lot of community relations, a lot of relationship building, and really brokering a deal with Native Hawaiians in the area. And so what we promised was that the state of Hawaii would lease the land to the Department of Human Services for 5 years to allow us the opportunity to respond to the wildfires. But after the 5 years, we would actually turn the land over to our Department of Hawaiian Homelands, and we would actually fulfill a promise to Native Hawaiians and accelerate a promise that was made by 17 years. And so this really became a solution, not just for the short-term interim housing, but a long-term promise that our governor is now fulfilling for Native Hawaiians that is generations coming.
Mm. Yeah, that is a story and a component that we want to make sure is not lost in this because it's woven into years, 100 years of recovery and renewal. So how did you ensure that the voices of the residents of Lahaina themselves shaped this? That even Mark, you and the team from Bassini and Lagoni had gone over and participated in some of these community meetings. How did you ensure that those voices were heard?
So we partnered with community leaders. When it came to Ka Laʻi Ola and the branding, we identified a well-respected cultural practitioner in the area to actually empower him and his community to brand the name of this village because it brings that energy, that spirit, and that connection back to the place and the people. We looked at other leaders that really had a connection to the place and we brought them into our planning charrettes and Dave was very helpful in conducting listening sessions that heard their voices and we incorporated a lot of the insights that they shared with us into the design plan. ultimately, the design of Ka Laʻi Ola is unlike anything that anyone in disaster recovery has ever seen. I have now hosted dignitaries, political leaders. I have hosted people that are very well known in this space. And the consistent message I continue to hear is we have never seen anything like this. The work that Mark has done and his team is incredible. It is truly a design layout that allows this community to foster relationships, to repair and recover their lives, and to live the way that they're used to living. And it does, in fact, come through in the design as a place of peaceful healing and recovery. We have what's called pods, and within those pods, subpods. And we have different size bedrooms, so 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, studios that are within a subpod. We have a family right now where there's a senior who lives in a studio next to her son and his family who lives in a 2 bedroom, next to their cousins who's just a couple in a 1 bedroom. And they love each other and they come together, and then they don't like each other, so they go back out to their separate units. It's just the way we are and the way we've grown up here for generations in Hawaii. And Mark and his team was able to really capture the essence of that spirit and really kind of bring it through in the community design process. And I think it's not just even just a human side, it's also just the cost effectiveness of the entire project, maximizing our emergency proclamation and making sure that we could build not just a healing space, but a cost effective space that really kind of worked within the budget parameters that we had. So a lot of kudos to the Spaseni and Lagodian team. It really made a big difference.
Thanks, Kimo. But I think from our perspective, as we got involved with this, and Dave, myself, and Garrett Wilkinson in our office, who really heads up our planning effort, because it was a planning effort. Kimo had been able to gather all this different aspects of the housing in terms of the manufactured and different sizes and all that we're going to have to do that. So there was some puzzle pieces there, but as part of that community outreach and listening to the community and hearing them talk about how critical the whole idea of growth in a neighborhood is for the family was key. But then to the big point of this piece of land has a long-term picture, and it has to be able to work way beyond this emergency component to be able to go back to the Native Hawaiians. So as we looked at that whole large-scale master plan and said, okay, one, we want to have an overall community that works for this immediate need, but then can become homes for individuals, but also creates, as Kimo mentioned, the pod, this small little grouping of, 5, 6, 7, 8 homes that extended family component can work with. And so by doing that, it creates these small, unique neighborhoods that then are interconnected through paseos and walkways, and is still very pedestrian oriented. And all of that coming together was a fun challenge for us as land planning architects to be able to get involved in that and be able to respond to what the community really wanted.
Mark, I and Dave as well, I think that the average person has no idea the intention that goes into land planning to create a community like you're talking about. And they just come home. I drive down my street, pull in my driveway and get out. And I have no idea, people have no idea all the work that's gone into the building of their home, let alone the land planning. So when you were with this diverse group of people and the partners that were there, was there anything specific that you heard that might have been different than, because you engage communities and other projects that you've been involved with, but was there anything that particularly resonated with you that you thought, okay, I'm hearing this and I really want to do this one particular thing? Because there was a lot of high stakes. There's a lot of things that were coming together.
Scott. Absolutely. And when you talk about when we're looking at typical communities and we're doing that, you're looking at that long-term growth and how do you create the synergy and provide activity for people and all that. Well, for here, it was all that, but as Kimo mentioned, it was all about the healing. And so that was this extra layer that got added on top of the whole design concept is How do you create a space that allows for that? Because quite honestly, the piece of land sits right above what happened in Lahaina. And you look across that and you see that. And in a way, it's hard to sit and look at that as things have come along over the last year and a half, where there is now activity of seeing the growth of Lahaina again. There's a lot of healing in that, and being able to locate it and have those people see it and see it grow and come back, I think adds to that whole healing component.
And just to build on that, Scott, I think, one thing that I saw that was very unique is that, our policy prioritize people first, and then the site and the planning came second. And so this site is on a slope. It's actually where the wildfires originated. To Mark's point, it actually burned the Waikuli area that this site now sits above. But the engineering and the civil work is actually not to code, but it does not compromise on critical life safety, health, culture, or environment. And so Mark and his team was able to hear the priorities of people, and we designed space based on those priorities, and the site and the planning followed from there. And we maximized the use of the emergency proclamation. We brought together the best minds. Traditionally, the building code process and the permitting process requires us to follow, it needs to be a balanced site. Buildings need to be X amount of feet away from each other. There's a lot of restrictions, but that doesn't lend to what goals our state was trying to achieve. And so Mark's team was actually really able to come in with some creativity and some innovative thinking with our planning team, with our county government. And instead of policymakers, you pull together the engineers, the people who are boots on the ground approving site plans, and they're having a collaboration on what works, what doesn't work. And we fast track permitting. We got our grading permit in 2 weeks. Traditionally takes 8 months. So these are, just to build on what Mark's saying, coming in with a very new perspective of listening to those needs, but then really kind of trying to figure out how can versus why no can.
And Kimo, you've mentioned a couple of times the state of Hawaii, the Governor Josh Green, the emergency proclamation. This project depended upon extraordinary partnerships. Yeah, Governor Green's office, the state as a whole, major funders, the Hawaii Community Foundation, and all the funding that came in from around the world to Maui Strong Initiative. How did those, you were at the apex of things. You were one of a few people that were there and saw the vision, and all these things were happening. How did those relationships form? And, expand a little bit on that, how it really played this key role on bringing everything together for Ka Laʻi Ola.
Sure. Well, it starts with the fundamental belief that, it really does take a village and a community. A community simply enables us to help people in a way that we simply just cannot as individuals. And so I think coming forward with that mindset, with that attitude, and really kind of be locally grounded in those values, I think, it lends to leadership, and people gravitate toward that. And I think naturally it's just really painting that vision, making sure we're consistent with our government partners. But I think that, HomeAid Hawaii, as a not-for-profit developer, we were also the perfect entity that could bring together a public-private partnership to build the capital stack that included hundreds of donors that donated over $42 million toward the project, government public resources that provided another $113 million toward the project, donated land that's valued at least another 35 million, plus the builder industry, who is providing at least another 11 million of pro bono services, plus the emergency proclamation that is providing at least another 5 million of discounts. And so bringing together all those elements, it takes a community, it takes leadership to paint that vision, and it takes supporters in the community to align with that vision and to execute a project. And ultimately, that was our role. And I think that was probably most important role that we could have played in this entire experience.
And again, it was a process that unfolded. Every day, as you and I talked, particularly in those first couple of months, there were new elements that you had to navigate and new partners and who would be part of things and not. And both Dave, you and Mark and Kimo, we've talked a little bit about modular prefabricated housing, but dive a little bit further into that. Kimo, you mentioned that you had people coming from all over the world offering their product and then ultimately making the decision of the different manufacturers. And then Mark, you and Dave, how do you fit that into your land plan? Kimo, how does modular and prefabricated housing allow you to meet emergency needs? And how did you vet and how did you ultimately choose those that will create this community?
So there were at least over 135 different modular manufacturing companies that were interested in doing business. When we vetted most of them, I would say at least 80% has not been in business for more than 5 years. That provided the first narrow filter. But for those who were legitimate, who would be able to honor their warranties for at least 5 years in interim housing period, had legitimate business credit, finances, practices, and their products were vetted to the point where they would be able to last. There was a lot of assessment that went into those decisions, but it also takes a collaboration with the planners such as Mark and others that makes sure that the product actually is going to work for the site. Ultimately, this was also about achieving deep, affordable housing. In America, we have built for commercial buildings and for single family homes. And for everything under LIHTC, which is here in Hawaii, 60% and below AMI, there is what we call missing middle housing. And what we really saw after the Great Recession was that there was about 45,000 people here in the state of Hawaii who were in the middle class that fell into poverty, and they could not rebound because they could not afford housing. And so they got stuck in poverty, and that became a pipeline into homelessness. And so choosing the right modular product was also about consideration of how much can they afford in rent in comparison to what they're making, and ensuring that the product works for that purpose alone. So coordinating that with Mark and the planners and making sure it works for the site was all kind of part of the vetting process.
So Mark and Dave, on that note, were both of you concerned about this spectrum of modular pre-manufactured buildings? How did those design elements factor into you creating this community that needed to have dignity and a sense of home and that helped in the healing process? Because you had to pull all of that together to fit that into the site. Any thoughts or comments about that?
From my perspective, it was, Kimo done a great job getting these manufacturers to commit. And they were a real variety and they lived very differently. So orientation of some of the units didn't work so well if it was to another unit and things like that. So we really had to look at that. And then on top of that was the timeline of deliverables and when they would each arrive. So as we developed these pods, we were putting them in and say, these all work great. We get the mix of unit types for, some singles, some doubles and all of that. And then turns out, we can't get a delivery until here. So it was a lot of back and forth on that. And I think we ended up being able to work into a module that allowed us to juggle that as we moved through, because not every pod is the same, but we were able to accommodate several different configurations that allowed us to work with all these different manufacturers over the course of very short course of construction, actually.
So,
Yeah.
It came together.
yeah, and that was really the crux, I think, of being able to execute this so swiftly. It's a very rugged and difficult site, and we all know how expensive that site was to prepare to drop these modular homes on it. If we were to do this in a stick-built, slab-on-grade solution, there'd be a few houses up there in the 2 years since the fire. The fact that
Not 450 that there is now. Yeah.
exactly. So the fact that it was really get the site prepared to drop these modular homes on and hook them up, that was really the key. And one of the other challenges that we were faced with was the aesthetics, right? When at the onset of this, I think we all, at least at our shop, we wanted to do this authentic Polynesian architecture, that was cultural and indigenous and sensitive to the context. But, with modular housing, it's a challenge to get there. So there's a collection of different manufacturers, different aesthetics, different styles. And at the end of the day, as it's built out now, I think it may not have hit the Hawaiian style, but it is an eclectic and vibrant community of diversity. And I'm still amazed that it came together as fast as it did.
Well, let's move to that. I mean, we're coming up to the dedication, but there's been people that have been living there for a while as these have been completed. So, Kimo, since the first families moved in, what moments have affirmed, this is not a community that no one's living in? I mean, people are actively part of this right now. What has been affirming as far as why this has all mattered? Have there been some very meaningful stories of transformation that you've already witnessed just in the last couple of months?
Yeah. I think that this project has taught me that there's always a way. And I think we are just ending our construction 18 months after we broke ground. 450 homes on a 54-acre site in 18 months, I think, is one of the most incredible accomplishments of my life. And so I go back to, there's always a way. It's who you bring to the table, and it's how we execute as a team. The residents who started moving in, add to the complexity of everything that Dave and Mark just described, add to this, we started moving people in during construction and commingling construction and operations. That was an interesting decision, but it actually, to see the first residents move in at the 1 year and remembrance or anniversary of the wildfires with Dave, giving these residents keys was probably the most fulfilling moment that I've personally had on the project. That night, I was just reflecting on a year of quite a lot that happened, and to see families, after so much turmoil, so many different places of living, I think that hearing just who they were as part of these communities and their lives before the fires, and just the ability to come back to that moment of pause and start back from where they left off. That was reaffirming for me that we're doing the right thing. And
Yeah,
these community members are generational community members. Like, they're longtime families who they all kind of know each other, but we all bring them to a site and they're now reconnecting. And so I believe that we're going to have a community and what we're seeing through our community events is they're becoming more normal. This is really an inclusive community, and I think that as we continue to learn a lot about their stories and their history, I think that different from Hurricane Katrina 20 years ago, the difference is we're building community and we're building connection rather than just housing.
And Kimo, that is so key to pause and reflect, because that's why we're doing what we're doing. And Dave, you were actually there when a few of these first keys were given out, and to be able to experience that, how did that reinforce the design, the healing, and even for you personally, because you were there when the fires happened, you were now there handing the first few keys out. Reflect back on that, and not to put you on the spot, but I know that, I mean, I'm getting teared up at that, at just thinking about that, but walk us back through that.
Kimo just said it. He said it was one of the most fulfilling things he experienced through this project. I would go even farther to say it was probably one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done or ever felt. We left that island 2 years ago in fear and trauma, horrified. And to come back a year later and witness that and know that we had some part in it was the most fulfilling emotional feeling I've ever had. The one thing that really stood out to me, I mean, to see the smiles on these faces of these families, it's indescribable. But I had a brief conversation with the governor Kimo, the governor, and Mayor Bisson, we're all represented, and we're pretty much heading up the event. But Governor Green came over, and we chatted for a little bit, and he told me that the only way this worked was because of the public-private partnership. He said, we did our part, and then you guys, meaning HomeAid, stepped in and did what you do. And we just got out of the way. He was very appreciative of HomeAid and what we were able to do. What stood out even more to me was this could have been a big media spectacle. Politicians turn things like this into a big photo opportunity. He intentionally kept the press out of there. He told me this was about these people that are healing, and the last thing that he wanted was a spectacle. Kudos to the governor for the way he handled this, for his belief in the public-private partnership and what can be accomplished. It was just something. I don't interact with politicians a lot, certainly not like Kimo, but that brief interaction just built a tremendous amount of respect in me for him. So I thank him for everything that he's done to make this possible.
Yeah. So Kimo, looking forward, you've mentioned 5 years. What's the long-term vision for Ka Laʻi Ola beyond that 5-year mission? And is there anything that you would do differently if you'd start over, the process, the stakeholders, or anything that you would be sharing for others that might be in a similar situation?
For the future for Ka Laʻi Ola is to operate for 5 years total through 2029. During that time, our residents, and by the way, HomeAid Hawaii is the property management entity for this village. We are the broker for human services and the state government to be effective in this strategic partnership long term. We will continue to improve the site. We will continue to iterate and just continue to improve the little details that continue to make a connection and feeling of home. And so we're committed to this long term. We are also supporting a lot of these residents with their rebuilds, with gaining access to other permanent housing solutions. And I think that a lot of the conversation is around how do we rebuild Lahaina? How do we re-envision a future that is different, or do we rebuild what we just want to see happen today? And so that's really the next conversation in this journey. We hope that the community is able to meet the moment. There's quite a lot of federal resources getting poured into Lahaina to support the rebuild. And then, of course, we want to make sure that our residents are able to thrive, that this is a new chapter in their lives and that they're able to move from it. A lot of them, honestly, Scott, are saying that the post-disaster recovery process is, if not more traumatic than the wildfire itself. It's hard. And we want to make sure that, we create the spaces that supports their long-term recovery and just ensures that our partnerships that we've started are continued beyond just the development. In terms of, in addition to just sort of the vision and next steps for Ka Laʻi Ola, for HomeAid, we are also looking at our long-term vision for Maui. And so there is a need for more economic development, and there is land that is viable for new development for communities that can actually transition these folks from interim housing to permanent housing and actually start looking at, the working poor who are able to build thriving futures there in Maui generally. So we're committed to this for generations and look forward to part of this.
Yeah, and the three of you have been really involved with something extraordinary. Not only they're just on Maui, but for all of Hawaii and around the country and even around the world. So I would hope that whoever listens to this podcast, builders, policymakers, other community leaders, that they take away some of the passion and the vision that each of you have brought to this. As we look to kind of close out, whether or not they're facing natural disasters or just even housing crisis, which you're really keying off of, Kimo, is there for each of you, any key takeaway? One takeaway about either hope or action, resilience. Dave, what's your takeaway for our listeners?
For me, boy, a trust in community. This community, again, I've never seen anything like it, how the people pull together. I mean, the day after seeing people doing everything that they could to help others. And then a word that I learned that a year later when we're on the beach in Kaanapali watching the ceremony, kokua, I think I'm saying it right, Kimo, which is a Hawaiian expression for doing something kind for others without expecting anything in return. I think if everyone on this planet could learn that word and live by it, the world would be a much better place.
That's beautiful. Mark, what about you?
For me, the takeaway is that the community is now its own, and the people are making it their own and being able to grow and recover. That's what we set out to make happen. And I think for the few times that I spoke to just a few members there, it was to see their faces and know that they were going to make this their community was the best thing I could see.
Yeah, and Kimo, you're native Hawaiian, and you and I've talked a lot about your passion and your love for your home, your homeland. What's your takeaway?
Yeah. I love this place more than anything else, and I feel a responsibility that what I do here for my home and to Dave's word kokua, it's a responsibility for me to demonstrate what is possible, but to give it back to those who need it most. And so my takeaway is that this is meant to be shared with HomeAid America, with government officials across the world, across the country. Like I said before, there's always a way, and there is a lot to be learned from Ka Laʻi Ola from a builder's perspective, with innovative designs, innovative methods, from a policy perspective on developing new processes that actually fast tracks development, gets rid of the red tape, and just gets housing built. From a community development side, bringing people together to envision a place that is, to Mark's point, theirs, that they can own, that is part of who they are. I think that there's always a way. And, that's what the essence of kokua is, to give back. And that is what I believe we should be doing after this moment. We will celebrate it. We are marking a big milestone, but now we get to learn from it and grow from it and hopefully make different communities better than even just this one.
Beautiful. Well, Kimo, Dave, and Mark, thank you for sharing this powerful story of resilience and collaboration. Ka Laʻi Ola reminds us that in the face of just unimaginable loss, that we can create not just housing, but healing spaces where people can return and reclaim their lives with dignity. Yeah. To our listeners, if today's conversation inspired you, please take the time and view the links in the show notes to learn more about Ka Laʻi Ola, support the ongoing works in Maui and of HomeAid Hawaii, or to get involved with HomeAid's mission nationwide. This is Unsheltered Conversations. I'm Scott Larson. Thank you for listening and helping us build not just homes, but hope.